Hello, and welcome to Mayor Brown's podcast series, Credibly Challenged. This podcast focuses on risk management issues for financial institutions of all sizes, particularly those in the banking sector. My name is Matt Bisanz, and I'm a partner in Mayor Brown's financial services regulatory and enforcement practice. Joining me today is Andy Spero. Andy is the founder and president of Spero Risk Associates, a specialty consulting firm that focuses on risk management, modeling, and loss forecasting. On today's program, we will talk about stress testing and how it relates to risk management. Andy has a lot of experience in this area, and I was really impressed in our preparation as to how much he's thought about these issues, not only on an institutional level, but also on an industry-wide level.
Thank you, Matt. I'm happy to be part of what I find to be a very informative series of interviews.
So let's dive right in with a little bit about the industry perspective that you bring. You've worked with a lot of people in a lot of institutions and probably hired a fair number yourself. What kind of background are you looking for from a good risk analyst or risk advisor?
Well, we're extremely choosy. For advisors, we want experts who have extensive banking experience, but who will do, not just talk. Be blunt, they need to know something that I don't. And they need to enjoy getting their hands dirty. Otherwise, it's just talk. And really, Matt, that's my job. For analysts, we want math majors and engineers who can communicate and have people skills. We'll teach the rest. Our firm's motto is thought before calculation. So we want conceptual thinkers who've learned their classroom lessons and love applying those concepts, but doing it independently. So curiosity, obsessive compulsiveness, they help. In fact, it's pretty much required because it's easier to pull someone back than it is to push them ahead. Our analysts need to be able to solve problems, new problems, and then they need to be able to streamline those solutions, systematize those, and integrate those in their work and our future processes. We're blessed to have exceptional ones. I've put together 3 large departments at 2 large banks. My current colleagues are the best yet. I want to collaborate with them and learn from them.
That's great. I appreciate your emphasis not only on solving a problem once, but finding a way to automate it. That there have been so many times that I've come into a client and found a document that they've said is very important, and it's dated about 5 years ago, and it was from some outside vendor, maybe a law firm or a consulting firm, and it really wasn't ever updated. It was designed once, and everyone envisioned the consultant would stay there, but the consultant went on their own way, and so now the client has been trying to make do with this document in a way that it really didn't know how to execute it or update it. And so it's great to hear that you are thinking about that long-term perspective. Thinking about the people, though, because as you said, they are really the key. What kind of advice would you give to someone who's new, who maybe would like to be on a team like yours someday?
So this is based on my personal experience, and I'd offer 2 suggestions. First, tackle the hardest problems that anyone will let you be around. Those problems exist because no one else has solved them. And if you fail, well, you're young, you did your best. If you succeed, then you're on your way to becoming an expert. There's really no downside. I'll tell you, it worked for me. A few years back, I was offered a position to head model risk at a top 10 bank. And that was partly because 25 years earlier, when the hiring manager at the top 10 bank was a credit analyst and lender, he had used automated spreadsheets that I had built to evaluate loans for leverage buyouts back in the mid-'80s. So, if you make a reputation for yourself at knowing something, that doesn't go away. Second, and this is a little bit harder when you're just starting out, but try to find a boss who wants to create the work environment they wish they had when they started out. This means finding someone who's willing to commit to give resources that you'll need to do the work the right way. I viewed that as my primary responsibility as a department head. That's how I run my firm today.
And as a department head and as a leader of a firm, you've helped build models and pretty much projects for every function in a bank, across all the risk stripes, market, operational, credit risk. And maybe this is a little more technical than how to get and train the best people. But I think nowadays you spend much of your time on loss forecasting. What's your philosophy for managing this type of risk, and how do you find stress testing to be a part of it?
Well, the short answer is it's how we live our lives by doing quick scenario analysis. All of us were constantly asking, what if? Which way should I go to work? How do I avoid so and so if I see them walking down the street? Can I live with the implications of eating the spiciest salsa? Most personal decisions involve trying to achieve our goal while limiting the chance of any type of harm. So we ask, what can go wrong? How much could I lose? What should I do about it? And in some cases, you conclude there's nothing to worry about. In other cases, you say, okay, let's try to do something to reduce the chance of something bad happening. Say you buy new tires so you don't lose control of your car, or you buy auto insurance or plan contingency actions. You have a spare tire and a jack, for example, to reduce the consequences of something bad happening, like a collision or a flat tire. So manage your bank risk the same way through what if analysis. The only difference is that people don't have to run computer programs to understand the implications of their decisions. Banks do because portfolios consist of thousands, sometimes millions of separate but not independent decisions. It's another way of saying if I don't know how anyone can it's another way of saying if I don't know how anyone can effectively manage a portfolio if they don't know how they could lose money.
It's a really good perspective, and certainly banks are worried about losing money, not only in this climate, but just on a day-to-day basis because of the intense competition in the industry and the intense global competition from other jurisdictions and from the fintech sector. So that bottom line focus is here to stay. Um, I work with a lot of mid-size and larger banks like your super regionals and a lot of CCAR banks that, for those who aren't in the know, undergo the supervisory stress testing with capital consequences from the Federal Reserve. Um, you led model risk at two of those CCAR banks. And I can say from, again, as an outsider's view, as outside counsel to these banks, that CCAR process adds a whole nother layer of accountability, that it's not just the dollar financial, whether or not the bank's making money, but the regulators really want to see a lot of justification for every decision in the stress testing process, and understand how the bank generated its data, how it made its models, how it's managing the risks from those models, and then using the outputs from the CCAR exercise to manage its risks more globally. In that really heightened environment, what's your approach to the model risk and validation process?
It's very straightforward. Validation answers two simple questions. Easy question is the math right? And the harder question is it the right math? Meaning, does it capture reality as we understand it? Folks with quant skills tend to be modelers. They tend to overemphasize the first question because it's their strengths. It's kind of natural. It's necessary, but having the math right isn't sufficient for a good model or a good stress test. The second question, is it the right math, is more important. It determines conceptual soundness, meaning representational faithfulness and reliability. So if you just know the math, challenge yourself to learn about the business. And the best way to do that is to ask people who've seen a lot and have drawn a lot of their own conclusions. They're not necessarily the most senior executives. In fact, you can find them at all levels of the organization if you look. We have clients with those two questions in their model risk policies and procedures. And as developers, we ask ourselves the same question. Is it the right math, and is our math right?
It's interesting you have those two questions. That I was talking to one of your peers a little while ago, and they had all of the math right. That as with any expert quantitative scientist, they got the math just right. But I kept pushing them because it seemed like they were struggling to say, well, what's the right math for this situation, or what's the way that this plugs into a certain type of business or asset class. And so that's really interesting to hear that I think you may be ahead of the curve there in how you are joining up the quantitative sciences to not the business practical sense. Um, so maybe tell me a little bit more about Spero Risk and what part of the risk management framework you specialize in. That stress testing, happens in pretty much every part of the bank now. Model risk is pervasive, but where is your sweet spot?
Well, we span just about everything related to valuation, modeling, and risk, but we do a lot of work in loss forecasting, both CECL and stress testing. In our view, stress testing should be the heart of risk management. It integrates every other risk management function. It creates a common vocabulary, which is extremely important, which reduces the cost of fragmentation and siloed activities. As a firm, our goal is always to integrate our work as much as possible so that you can use what we've done for other purposes, either now or some point in the future. For example, recently we were developing loss forecasting models for energy loans, and our client said, stop what you're doing and give me a report of your analysis. I don't need the model. I need your work to debate overlays for our current reserving methods. So if you're thoughtfully developing a model, the analysis, which involves a lot of slicing and dicing, will have multiple purposes. In fact, our data prep work is often used for other purposes too.
How do you manage that tension though of on one side that you're selling expertise, you're selling the slicing and dicing, picking the right way, designing the outcome, designing the model based on all of the things you've learned about the client, versus helping them develop a in-house knowledge to the problem that eventually you're going to go away, and they may stop the slicing and dicing, but they're going to need to have some understanding of what you've built for them.
We see no tension. Our goal is to use our expertise to develop tailored solutions and to build their in-house expertise. That's how we create value for them and for us. We have no interest in creating black boxes or dependencies. In fact, we frequently teach bank employees how to exploit our work. The best practice is to be as transparent as possible so that clients know what they're getting and can use what they got both for the stated purpose and any ancillary purposes, either now, during a project, for example, or after the project. We take transparency to the extreme. And when desired, we'll take the bank's own staff and make them part of our team so they can build their human capital, and so they can make themselves more valuable. That's how we get repeat business, actually.
I
We,
think one thing that's a really positive thing to hear. I think one thing that bank personnel often struggle with, even without great outside consultants like yourself, is the fact that they are in many cases siloed. That even if they're in a risk function, there might be multiple specialized teams within the institution. Maybe you have like an AML risk team that is designing filters for their wire transfers and other messaging systems, and then you have someone else who is designing models for their credit underwriting system, and you have people who are looking at portfolio analysis. And the one that always gets me is if you have two different teams, one doing a model on the credit underwriting at a loan level, and then you have a different team managing the risk of the portfolio once it's been made. If their models start to diverge, you end up with really inconsistent just perspective, not only results, but an inconsistent perspective. Um, this really doesn't sound like a particularly efficient approach from the few examples I've seen going into institutions. So, how do you help clients roll out their activities in a more uniform manner and try to avoid some of those inconsistencies?
well, it's the nature of stress testing. Stress testing speaks a common language of conditional expected loss, meaning the expected loss in certain circumstances. So stress testing provides a uniform measure, dollar losses, that might otherwise be missing in the myriad of alternative risk metrics that each silo produces, like hundreds and hundreds of pages of reports every month. So when you have siloed functions, you tend to have different information systems, different analytical systems for each of those purposes. to the point of having different definitions for common English words and different data fields, and data fields too, different definitions. Robust stress testing integrates data and definitions and reduces the confusion. We frequently use the analogy of the blind man and the elephant. One feels a wall, the elephant's side. Another one feels a rope, it's the tail. One feels a fan, it's the air. It's air, etc. None of the men knows that it's an elephant because they've not combined their knowledge. Stress testing forces or kind of enforces that consolidation across risk management.
It's interesting you talk about that approach of seeing the whole elephant and really feeling it in a meaningful way. That I have a friend who's at a super regional bank, and they often tell me about the difficulties they have with getting a grasp on not only the activities of the organization, but all of its data sources, its different data marts and data warehouses, and they'll sometimes say like, Matt, where are the rules for how we're supposed to be managing our data? And first time I pointed them at the cybersecurity regs, and they're like, no, that's not what we're talking about. I'm actually talking about, data governance things. And I was like, well, there really aren't laws around that. There maybe are some best practices, maybe some summary admonitions in different regulatory statements. But data governance historically has been left to the organization. But a lot of your models that you're describing, your scenario analysis, builds on that data. And so what's your views on data governance and standardization across the organization?
Well, my view might be longer than you want, but I'll give you the whole thing. Data governance and standardization, they're the foundation for useful information. Every competent developer will tell you that data prep consumes more time than any other model building activity. But from the bank's perspective, you have to view developmental data as not just something used by quants, but as a usable processed resource. For example, one client of ours that was being acquired, it sent our clean developmental database to the acquirer instead of its own credit files. So this might surprise you, but in 2023, the best way to build a complete and practical and unified risk data warehouse is to reverse engineer it. Let me explain, but let me rant a little bit first. Since the 80s, we've seen massive spending on data processing at banks. And most banks do a good job of keeping track of their customer records and their financial records. However, to generate useful information, it still seems to be a Sisyphean task for many of these organizations. Some try to build a new useful warehouse every few years, usually with a new head of IT and a new vendor or both. Other places have seen Tom's given up. It's been almost 20 years ago. I remember saying to someone who was involved in a data warehouse project, US defeated the Germans and the Japanese in less time than it's taken to build your warehouse. Today, I still don't know if they're finished. So we think it's a mistake to focus on the inputs, like the customer and accounting data, rather than on the output, which is useful information. What's useful to manage risk? Well, it's everything you need to forecast losses in different environments, different conditions, different circumstances. That's the data needed for stress testing. So the cheapest way to get the data you need to forecast losses is to try to forecast losses and see what you need and what you have and what's missing. When you're done, you have the basis of a useful warehouse along with a roadmap of what you need to improve. After that, it's just formalization and governance, which can actually start during development if you have rigorous developers. In addition, much of the developmental work and analysis, the slicing and dicing, that was used to determine the best relationships that you used in your models, that can be repurposed and standardized as part of that information system. Use everything, throw nothing away. Different analyses provide different perspective. Frequently, that can be used as corroborating evidence. Document it, be transparent, be organized, turn your modeling expense into investment with future value. That's our view of it.
So when you talk about reusing your analysis, reusing the different steps to throw nothing aside, there is a technical point that I wanted to touch on that you had mentioned to me earlier, around expected losses versus unexpected losses. That for modeling CECL or the accounting requirement for current expected losses, that's one approach. But then stress testing kind of thinks outside the box as to, well, what are unexpected losses? If there's a hurricane, well, what would the consequences be? We're not expecting there to be a hurricane. We don't know when's coming. There isn't something on the weather radar, but we still want to project the unexpected losses. And so that's two different frames of reference for modeling. Um, can you use the same models for those different purposes? Should you use different models? What's your view on this issue?
Well, if you would have asked us 5 years ago, and people did, we would have said that you have two purposes with very different economic and statistical characteristics, so different models were necessary. But since then, we've developed and applied economic theory and know that in most situations, one model can optimally serve both purposes with no trade-offs. If you take a typical CECL model and apply it to stress testing or vice versa, you're usually making pretty big compromises that might require a lot of overlays or qualitative adjustments and a lot of explaining, frankly. And if you don't know you're making those compromises, well, that's not good either. Without going into details, our approach realizes that not all of the observations in your historical sample sets are the same. They should be grouped differently and used differently. We're excited because it's downright the coolest and cleanest work we've ever done or we've seen in the field. It's sophisticated yet extremely intuitive.
I wish everything was as maybe intuitive to me as it is to you. That is one of the reasons why I started this podcast series, is because there is a lot of this implicit knowledge among experts like yourself, and there aren't many laws that govern these areas of risk management, in particular for stress testing. Really, there's very little law outside of some Fed guidance that is at the more technical end of Fed guidance on what banks must be doing in this area. So where do you look for guidance when you're applying this expertise, and how do you iterate it? When you say 5 years ago you had one approach and now you've developed a new approach, how did you make that kind of transition?
Um, I'll give you, let me start off with a little bit of a historical perspective. So stress testing is primarily used in market risk, which includes structural interest rate risk, in other words, ALM, and for credit risk. So for market risk, there's a long history of looking at both hypothetical and historical scenarios. In fact, those scenarios are built into much of the market risk and ALM software. I did enterprise-wide stress testing for market risk and ALM before the crisis, and I'd argue that even today, it's a much more mature field than credit risk. Credit risk at most places for a variety of reasons. There has been less of an emphasis on historical scenarios or hypothetical scenarios beyond the Fed's own hypothetical scenarios. So it's generally less well developed. Some of the larger places are expected, kind of, nobody wants to say required by the Fed, but are expected to integrate stress testing into their risk appetite framework by using estimated losses primarily as an indication of their risk profile to compare against the board's appetite for losses. If you want the board and executives to focus on possible ways to lose money, then stress testing is pretty much the best way to do it. From my experience, the most effective board members know that. As I mentioned earlier, everyone understands estimated dollar losses. Intuitive models help with those discussions. If no one understands the models, then it's all academic and not very useful, and no one is very passionate about it. It's just another part of the 300-page board reporting package.
Those discussions are good and certainly welcome, and we seek them out, but sometimes there can be over eager people sitting across the table who feel that part of that showing passion on a topic is finding a question or a criticism in everything that's brought before them. That if I raise an issue with everything that comes before me, then everyone knows I'm doing my job, because otherwise, why would I raise these issues? That kind of second guessing, though, can be difficult if something is being done correctly, or if you have come to the correct analysis and now it's being second guessed for no reason. When you are in those high pressure situations with board members and other senior executives, how do you manage the relationship?
That's it. We can break this down. When we think of any type of oversight, it's not just executives and the board, it's also internal audit, it's also regulators. So I'd break my recommendations down into like both tactical and strategic. And it's pretty much the same recommendation, which is tactically be transparent, have clear, concise, complete documentation. It's clear, and then clear, concise, well organized, and complete developmental evidence, all your analysis. Involve anyone who wants to be involved as early as possible. You have to think of good governance as following the golden rule. What would you want others to provide to you to understand their work? Then provide that to others. And that also, there's this really big benefit that if you enunciate what you're doing while you're doing it, it really helps you too, because it forces you to justify your own approach to yourself in real time. It's kind of like, don't wait till the end to document it. Then the other part is just be strategically transparent. Be realistic, admit to the program's weaknesses. Every program has them. Have a credible plan to overcome those weaknesses.
It's helpful. One area where I've seen some programmatic weaknesses um, has been in the implementation of ESG related stress testing. That there's a lot of blank paper in that field, and there's particularly a huge debate over whether regulators should be imposing more prescriptive stress testing or scenario analysis around the climate change aspect of ESG risk. Some banks are forging ahead on quantification. Others are focused maybe more on procedural controls, and some maybe aren't there yet. But what is your view on using models to understand ESG risk?
Well, if you look at SR 12.7, the Fed's guidance on stress testing, it says that that the bank's framework should include the bank's exposures, its activities, and risks. I mean, that's kind of obvious. It makes a lot of sense. So if hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, earthquakes, whatever occur in your footprint, and if you've lost money on those events in the past, then it's worthy of analysis. But that analysis is only possible if you've stored and organized the relevant data regarding those losses. After all, statistical models simply quantify historical relationships. No data, no relationships. So for what it's worth, when we were modeling defaults for banks in the Southeast, we had to control for hurricanes because we saw spikes in defaults after the hurricanes. But those higher defaults didn't lead to higher losses. So a lot of no loss defaults. We wondered if that was just particular to our clients, but by looking at charge-offs for all the banks in the footprint, we found it was generally true. As always, you got to ask the question, what's the best use of limited risk management and stress testing resources?
Great. Well, I do want to respect your resources and really appreciate the time you've spent with us today. Andy, thank you so much for participating in the Credibly Challenged podcast. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. Without you, we wouldn't have a reason to be here. And so we appreciate you listening to us. Have a great day.
Thank you, Matt.